Hello guys, Juan Hernandez for cgboost.com. Welcome back to another cgboost tutorial. This time we will talk about UDIMs. Let's take a look at what they are and how we can use them in order to reach great amounts of details for creatures and characters or anything we might need. This video covers a lot of small topics, so I would like to make a super quick overview of this video so you know what to expect, and maybe if you are looking for something specific, you can go right to it, or if you already know the basics, you can skip that and go to the interesting parts. This video is for intermediate users, so you should have at least a basic understanding of how to work with the UVs and what they are for. First, we will have some simple theory, so you can have a basic understanding of what UDIMs are and how they work. Then we take a look at how to set up UDIMs for UV work in Blender, taking a look at the interface and our current options. After that, we start with our practical examples. Before talking about any painting, I actually want to share some cases where UDIMs can be useful so you can have a taste of what they can do. Then we move into the painting setup. Here we can check how we can start painting. Also, I give you some software alternatives and some comments about that. Finally, we can go over some impractical cases where it is actually better to avoid using UDIMs so you don't find yourself in a complicated situation. Hope you can find any of this information useful. There is quite a lot to cover, so let's get started. Let's see what UDIMs are and why they are helpful. UDIMs are essentially just an UV offset, which allows you to fit a sequence of images as a single texture, which you can use in your shaders. So basically they can help you create a bigger texture image by using multiple images of smaller size. You are probably familiar with the UV editor in Blender. This area where we lay out our UVs is called UV space. And traditionally, if we wanted to do any texture painting or baking of any sort, we were limited to using this 0 to 1 area of the UV space. Well, that's where UDIMs can be useful. They will allow you to expand this area you can use for your UVs. By creating an offset of the original 0 to 1 UV space, we refer to this offset as UV tile. Each UV tile has a number, and this number changes according to the position in the UV space. And each tile can contain its own image texture. In the UDIM workflow, the first available tile is labeled as 1001. The fourth digit refers to the tile number along the x-axis, and by UDIM standards we go into the positive x direction up to 10 tiles. The third digit refers to the tile position along the y-axis, and increases by moving into the positive y direction, stacking rows above each other technically with no limit. If you wonder what happens after you reach 9 rows along the y-axis, in the next row, the second digit will increase one number and the third digit resets to 0. So we can continue working with the third digit another 9 rows before increasing the second digit again. These numbers not only help us get around in UV space, but they are also used to determine where image textures belong by looking for each number in the name of the files. So anytime you have a bunch of UDIM textures, you will find their tile number somewhere in the name, so they can be loaded as a sequence and properly placed in the correct tile. And the reason why all of this can be useful is because they will help you reach higher amounts of resolution in a very effective way. It is indeed faster to load and render a single 4K texture rather than 16 of them, but what happens when that single 4K texture is far from sufficient for what you need? Then it's way more efficient to load and render 16 4K textures rather than a single 16K texture. We will get more into details in a bit. Before taking a look at some practical cases, let's see how we can set up this in Blender. The first thing you need to know is that there is no special setup you need to do for you to start preparing your UVs with UDIM workflow. You don't need to create a new texture with tile to turn on. You don't need to manually add each tile or fill them or anything like that. The only thing you should be interested in is expanding the UV grid so you are able to work comfortably. You can find this option inside of the UV editor under the View tab. Keep in mind that you need to have an object selected and be in edit mode to be able to see this option. So here is where you can change the size of the UV grid. Currently the maximum size is 100 tiles. This option is nothing more than a visual help. Turning this on and off really does not activate any special function. Even before UDIMs were implemented in Blender, you were actually able to lay out UVs in UDIM format. It was a bit tricky to do without the grid, but as I mentioned earlier, UDIMs are basically just an offset and they look only at UV space. So although the maximum size of the grid is currently 100 UDIM tiles, it's really just an overlay. You can still lay out UVs further along the y-axis and prepare UVs for 1000 tiles if you need to, and it will be recognized in any software. Please note that the grid overlay changes with whatever texture you load into the UV editor. So if you load a single image texture, the grid will disappear, and closing the texture will put the grid back. Same if you load a UDIM sequence, then you will see the correct amount of UDIM tiles, which the texture sequence has. And again, if you close it, then you go back to the original grid size. Once you have your grid ready, you can start to lay out some UVs however you need. You can do this in the traditional way you are used to preparing UVs, only that now you are not limited to a single tile, but you can use as many of them as you want. The only rule to keep in mind is that UV islands should not go across tile borders, so you should always keep it inside of one tile. Also, even though you can have lots of resolution, you should have an idea of how much you actually need. At the end of the day, UDIMs do cost resources, so you want to keep working in an optimized way. The first practical case is organic models. Organic models, often characters or creatures, are usually made with a single mesh, which means that UVs are confined in a single UV space. So using a single image texture can be a big limitation. As an example, here we have a space lizard pet I made a while ago. The whole body is a single mesh, and without UDIMs, I would have big limitations regarding texture resolution. For example, if the whole creature had UVs in a single tile, even if I had a 4K or 8K texture, the head will only contain a smaller percentage of the texture resolution, right? Which means it could look fine from far, but if I wanted to do some close-up renders as this one, then I will start to see some very bad texture quality. Instead, I can split my UVs into multiple tiles, where the body and the head can occupy more UV space, therefore gaining more resolution for my renders. And if you ask me, well, how many UDIMs should I use? That depends entirely on how close you want to get with your camera. In this case, the left side of the head is located in a single tile, which means that the head from this side has a 4K texture, the same for the neck and the same for the torso. If my final render is 2K or 4K from this distance, then I know I'm good to go. But if I wanted to make a render of the eye covering the whole camera, then I know I will need more resolution around the eye, so it's sufficient for final rendering. So it really depends on what the final product looks like. You can lay out your UVs on multiple tiles to cover as much UV space as needed. Other than that, the process really does not differ from the traditional way you make your UVs, only that now you are not limited to a single tile, but you can use more of them. Once your UVs are done, your model is ready for texturing. You can either do the texturing process in Blender, or you can export this straight into a texturing software and work there, but more about that later. Our second useful case is high poly models. Although most of the time we relate UDIMs to textures of color, not many realize that they can help us display back high poly geometry as well, thanks to displacement maps, which are saved as image files and are fully dependent on resolution too. So if you make your high poly version in Blender, or if you take it to another software like ZBrush and make a 60 million sculpt in there or whatever high poly count you need, which is what I did, the only way you will be able to display this back is if you have enough texture resolution for your displacement maps. That means that if you baked the displacement in a single UV tile, none of the sculpted detail will be visible due to the lack of resolution. So apart from color textures and maps, UDIMs can be helpful to display actual geometry detail, which you need to transfer back to your low poly model. If you're doing the high poly sculpt in Blender, then technically you can skip this step and use the multi-resolution modifier instead, which has nothing to do with texture resolution. But if you were doing something for a client, or if you're planning to use the model elsewhere, then you are definitely going to need this in order to bake everything and transfer all the necessary details along the model to the client or to the other software. The third case where UDIMs can be useful is simple material editing. So even if your model is not a single mesh, in fact, there can be lots of different meshes, UDIMs can be useful to work on big parts of your model, keeping the necessary resolution we need. As an example, we have the robot from my Evil Sloth project. There is just a couple of metal types in this robot, and if I had no UDIMs, I would have to treat each UV tile as an individual material in order to keep the same resolution. Instead, I can use UDIMs, so I'm able to paint across all parts at the same time, just like if it was a single image texture, and make tweaks and changes globally. So, in the same way you would lay out UVs on a single tile, you would spread your UV islands on multiple UV tiles in order to keep the necessary resolution and being able to paint and bake textures into the UVs. And same as I mentioned before, once your UVs are prepared, you can export this model to Substance or Mixer, or if you want to keep working in Blender, then you're ready to go. And the last case where UDIMs can be useful is for unplanned texture changes. This advantage applies only for different texturing softwares, so unfortunately not possible in Blender right now, but I thought it would be worth mentioning anyways. Texturing softwares such as Substance Painter will allow you to update the UVs of your asset even after you started to paint. This can be very useful if at some point you realize you lack resolution in a certain area. You can freely change your UV layouts to occupy more UV space, switch it with the old model, and keep all the texturing work you did so far. This can be a lifesaver as you don't have to worry much about UV changes. In fact, especially for commercial things, I never worried anymore about big changes even after textures were done, because I knew I could update my UVs, recalculate all the paint work, and go on with my project, which is actually pretty cool. Another thing you can do, and it's related to this topic, is to change the texture resolution for specific UV tiles. So if your character or creature is composed of many 4K textures, and at some point you realize you always see the face close up to the camera but never his feet, you can do a switch and use a 8K texture for the head and a 1K texture for the feet if that's sufficient. This way, UDIMs can help you prioritize what parts of the model need resolution, and you can change this resolution later to optimize the way your resources are used. Thanks to all of this, the painting process remains in a big part as a non-destructive workflow, giving me more freedom for anything I create. Now let's talk about the painting setup. Once your UV layout is done, then your model is ready for texturing. You can either export your model to a different software or keep working in Blender. We will take a look at both, but something important to mention is that unfortunately, some features such as UDIM packing or baking are currently not supported in Blender. During this Google Summer of Code, there are plans to improve UV editing when working with UDIMs, which is great, but without the missing features, mainly baking, I prefer to work elsewhere. This doesn't mean you cannot work in Blender. I love working in Blender. I just want it to be very clear that there can be some limitations until UDIMs are fully implemented, especially for the way I like to work, so it's a good thing to keep it in mind. To set up UDIM painting in Blender, first we have to create the image files where we want to paint on. Back to the UV editor, you can click on New Texture, name the texture as you want, set up the desired texture resolution, and make sure to turn on Tile in the bottom checkbox over here. This will create the first tile, which is 1001. Then if you go over to the Image tab, you will see a list of the current amount of UV tiles, which in this case is only one. You can click on the plus sign to add more tiles and set up the count you need. That means that if you prepare the UVs on 20 tiles, then you need to create the remaining 19. After that, you can press OK and you will see how Blender automatically created the rest. Just make sure to save the files. All textures will be saved automatically with the right numbering, so you don't have to worry about that. Only pick a place on your computer and you are good to go. Lastly, you can create a material and you can load your image sequence in the texture node. As you can see, although we have multiple files, it behaves as a single texture, and we can see at the bottom that the UDIM tiles are on. So you are able to layer things on the node editor or modify the texture procedurally. Finally, you can go into texture paint mode and start painting. From here, you can work as you traditionally work without the UDIMs. If you choose another texturing software, you could try something like Mari, Substance Painter, or Quixel Mixer, or any software of your choice. To do this, export your model with ready UVs as an OBJ, FBX, or Alembic file, In the case of Painter, you can drag and drop the file into the interface, set up normal map format as OpenGL, and make sure that UV tile workflow is turned on. After that, you can make basic necessary maps inside of Substance Painter and start with your painting right away. Similarly, if you pick Quixel Mixer, which is a free alternative, you can make a new project, set up the model type to custom model, load your model, and set texture sets from UDIMs, and then you're ready to start painting. One reason I really like painting software is because of its clean output. So even if I have 200 painting layers, the final output is a single UDIM sequence with everything baked in. So I don't need to have in my computer dozens of files for every layer I want to make. In case you are interested in learning more about Substance Painter, our friend Martin actually has a course on that topic, so make sure to check that out. Lastly, let's see some cases where you actually want to avoid using UDIMs as a solution. Otherwise, you could be wasting resources or reach hardware limitations unnecessarily. The first case is tileable high-frequency details. Sometimes it is useful to split the type of detail you are using in your materials. If there is something that you just apply as a tile texture, it could be more efficient to add it on top in the shading network than have it baked in your UDIM sequence. For example, if you have a piece of garment and I want to get the cloth pattern as a bump or normal map, it is better to add it on top in the material network with tiling rather than paint it directly on the UVs and bake it. The reason to this is that once you bake anything into textures, all of the color information is limited to the image size of the file. So whatever you do, if you take a 4K cloth pattern and bake it, you will lose very fine detail, which might look fine from far, but once the camera gets close, you will see the issue. Instead, you can tile it, so that 4K pattern will repeat along the whole surface, keeping those sharp details all over the place. It's the same thing if you have some creature pores or anything similar that just repeats and it's very small. It's just better to keep it as a tileable texture on top rather than baked in with everything. The second case is procedural shading. Just because you have UDIMs and endless amounts of resolution, it doesn't mean that you should forget about doing things procedurally. Especially for static things, you can achieve great results by layering textures and mixing nodes and keeping render times low rather than having hundreds of UDIMs for the whole environment and having to load everything for rendering. Usually I try to keep UDIMs and texture painting to all of my hero assets. That means characters, main props, or anything special that has some importance. But if there is anything where I can achieve the same quality and better performance, then it's way better to do that. If you are in a studio environment, this is something that is usually discussed up front. But if you are a freelancer or learning on your own, then it's a good thing to keep in mind. The last case is too many UDIMs. This is directly related to the type of resources you have, but try to keep UDIM count as low as possible to work efficiently while still achieving the goal in mind. Regardless if you work in a studio or have a killer machine, saving up render time is always valuable. So this is important no matter what your resources are. As I said, UDIM count will depend entirely on what your final render looks like, but just to give you a rough idea of how they are used in the industry, here I have some couple of examples. In the movie Pacific Rim, Jaegers had up to 1000 UDIMs, which is pretty crazy. These assets were massive, and there were lots of close cameras along the whole movie from all angles, so they had to be very detailed. Some creatures in the Godzilla movies had around 300 UDIMs. You can see it's way less than those robots from Pacific Rim, and still sufficient for this kind of project. Some animals from the Lion King live action had something around 20 UDIMs in 8K resolution. They were, of course, covered in fur for the big part, so you couldn't see everything, but again, you can see the count is way less and still sufficient. Most of the close-up shots were usually to the head of the animals, so a lot of detail was needed in that area. And some people have asked about my personal projects. I usually stick around 10 or 20 UDIMs depending on what I do, and you can definitely go lower. One thing you can do to check out the current resolution of your model is adding a UV checker when you are preparing your UVs. If the texture looks already sharp at, let's say, 2K, then you know 100% it's going to look great at 4K, and if you really need it, you can go 8K as a last resource. This way you have some room to shift sizes. So guys, this is it for this video. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask in the comment section. From the last videos, quite a lot of you asked about rigging bat and dragon wings, also about modeling and rigging the robot arm. I definitely take those comments into account, so thanks for writing that. If you have any new topics in mind or anything that you would like to know, don't be afraid to ask. Don't forget, if you are interested in learning more about Substance Painter, check out Martin's course at cgboost.com. If you are just starting up with Blender, you can sign up to our free Blender Beginners course or get access to our free resources where only an email is required. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos, and see you next time.